Hello and welcome to the latest in our series of videos on Irish history. For today's video, we'll be looking at Ireland in 1900 to 1914 and the build up to the Easter Rising, the War of Independence, and of course what would subsequently lead to the Civil War. So, what we're looking at today is we'll be looking at what was the political situation in Ireland before the Home Rule crisis, what was this idea of cultural nationalism, what was the impact of this cultural nationalism, and what was the Home Rule crisis and what were its main events. Let's take a deep dive, shall we? So, the first thing that we need to know is the Act of Union. So, as we mentioned in our previous video on the 1798 rebellion, Ireland had lost its parliament in Dublin because of this. So, the Act of Union in 1801 meant that Ireland was now a part of the United Kingdom. Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales were all ruled directly from the Westminster Parliament in London. And now this meant that Ireland had 105 MPs in Westminster, and the Viceroy, of course, would represent the King in Ireland. Now, the different groups in Ireland at the time. You have, first of all, the Nationalists, best exemplified up to 1914 by John Redmond and his Home Rule Party. Now, although we speak in generalities, it is safe to say that the majority of Irish Catholics at the time were nationalists. They wanted Home Rule. This meant that having their own parliament in Dublin, which would govern Ireland's local affairs, such as education and health. Westminster would control trade and foreign affairs, and they felt that Ireland was being ruled badly by Westminster. Laws were passed for the benefit of the UK, but no account was taken of their effect in Ireland. The Home Rule Party represented the Nationalists. Their leader was John Redmond. They had about 80 MPs in Westminster, but the key thing, they wanted to maintain the link, that they were okay with the link with Britain. Now, the IRB, on the other hand, wanted a republic. The republic is a country not ruled by a monarch, where the power rests with the citizens to vote, so it's a democracy that votes upon its president. And a small minority of nationalists wanted more independence than Home Rule would bring, and this was this republic. This meant that Ireland would be independent of Britain. Many of these extreme nationalists belonged to the IRB and the Irish Republican Brotherhood. This was a secret society that wanted to gain independence by using violence. However, in 1910 there was no hope of Republicans staging rebellion, as they had very little support. And the other group was the Unionists. Now again, most Protestants were Unionists. This means that they supported the union with Britain. They were a small minority in the country, except in the northeast of Ulster. They didn't want a Home Rule Parliament because A, they were afraid that a Parliament in Dublin with a Catholic majority would discriminate against them. The irony is not lost. They believed that Home Rule was Rome Rule. Rome Rule, of course, referencing the Roman Catholic Church. They also believed that a Dublin Parliament would be bad for business, especially for industries such as shipbuilding and linen. These industries relied on free access to the British market, i.e., no taxes on their exports. Home Rule might put this access in danger. In Westminster, the Unionist Party were represented by the Unionists. And of course, the Unionist leaders were Edward Carson and James Craig. The next group we had in Ireland at the time was Jim Larkin and the ITGWU. So, many workers in towns and cities were poorly paid and lived in appalling conditions in slums. Jim Larkin set up a trade union called the ITGWU, which stood for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, in Dublin. Its aim was to fight for better wages and working conditions for Irish workers. It had 10,000 members in 1913. James Connolly was in charge of the Belfast branch of the union. Now, the success of the union worried the employers in Dublin. The employers were led by William Martin Murphy, and they decided to try and destroy the ITGWU by telling their workers that they had to leave their union or lose their jobs. In August 1913, Larkin called the workers out on strike. The employers hit back by locking out the workers until they left the union, and this lockout lasted for 5 months. Violent clashes, there was deaths. It was an awful, awful situation. But what it does do is it introduces the Irish people to James Connolly, who sets up the ICA, or the Irish Citizen Army, in 1913 to defend the workers from attacks by police during the lockout. Connolly wanted a socialist revolution. In the end, though, the union was defeated. The workers left the union and returned to work. Larkin left for America. But this idea of socialism stays with Connolly, and socialism is a social system that promotes equality among citizens through shared ownership of land and industries. So our next question, what is this cultural nationalism? So, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new type of nationalism emerged, hence cultural nationalism. Cultural nationalists stressed the cultural differences between Ireland and Britain. They came to feel that Ireland should have its own government because it had a different culture from that of Britain. At the same time, though, many Irish people were adopting more and more of the English culture as the 19th century progressed. This is called Anglicisation, and this is the spreading of English culture, i.e., language, games, and customs. How does this spread? Well, many people were speaking English, and the Irish language would decline. English was necessary if people were emigrating to Britain and America. The Irish speaking areas, the Gaeltacht, suffered most from emigration. Parents encouraged their children in these areas to learn English. Roughly in 1900, only 14% of people in Ireland spoke Irish. Many Irish people were playing English games as well, such as cricket, soccer, and rugby. Now, cultural nationalists were worried that there would be little difference in culture between Britain and Ireland. In that case, the Irish would not be able to claim the right to rule themselves, so they set up movements to encourage Irish culture. So the Irish response. First of all, you had the GAA, the Gaelic Athletic Association. So this was set up in 1884 by Michael Cusack, who set it up in Thurles, and its aims were to increase the numbers of people playing hurling and Gaelic football, and to draw up rules for the games, and to organise competitions. Now, clubs were established in almost every parish. Competitions were organised, and the first All Ireland was played in 1887. It made people proud of their parish. It was the first experience that Irishmen had of running a democratic organisation. It was the most successful of the cultural movements. In 1893, Owen MacNeill and Douglas Hyde started the Gaelic League. Its main aim was to stop the decline in the Irish language. It promoted the language by setting up an Irish language newspaper called An Clod of Solace, which means the Sword of Light. They were training teachers called Timmery who went all over the country teaching people the Irish language, and they encouraged Irish dancing and music. It slowed down the decline in the language. So both the GEA and the Gaelic League attracted people who wanted to end British influence in Ireland. People like Padraig Pearse felt that only an Irish government could preserve the Irish language. They became attracted to organisations that wanted to use violence to drive the British out of Ireland. These movements produced many of the leaders of the 1916 Rising, such as Padraig Pearse and Tomás MacDonagh. Many of its members switched from supporting Home Rule to becoming members of the IRA. The other change you see here is with the Home Rule crisis from 1912 to 1914. So in Westminster there were two major parties. You had the Liberal Party, which was led by Herbert Asquith. He was the Prime Minister in 1910. And you had the Conservatives, or the Tories, who were led by Andrew Bonar Law. They supported the Unionists and were against Home Rule. Now, in 1909 budget, the Liberal government increased taxes on the rich. The House of Lords, which dominated by the Conservatives, defeated the bill. This was the first time a budget had been rejected by the House of Lords. Asquith called for a general election on the issue of the House of Lords' ability to have the power of veto. Veto was the right of the House of Lords to reject bills passed by the House of Commons, or the Lords in the House of Lords could reject the bills placed by the MPs. The results of the election meant that the Liberal Party needed the support of the Home Rule Party if they were to continue with government. Redmond demanded Home Rule as a price for his support. So first Asquith passed the Parliament Act in 1911. This ended the veto of the House of Lords. They could reject the bill twice, but it would become law the third time. This meant that the third Home Rule Bill, which was passed in the House of Commons in 1912, would become law in 1914, despite the strong Conservative opposition in the House of Lords. So in March 1914, many British officers threatened to resign if they were ordered to act against Ulster and Unionists to enforce Home Rule in Ulster. Now, how did the others respond to this? Well, the Irish reaction, naturally enough, the Nationalists were delighted and the Unionists were disappointed. So Craig and Carson made Ulstermen sign the Solemn League and Covenant in 1912. They promised to use every means possible, including violence, to prevent Home Rule being imposed on them. And there you see them signing it in Ulster in 1912 on the Union Jack, and some people felt so strongly they signed this in their own blood. You also had the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, which was set to train up men to resist through force. They had 100,000 men in 1914. Guns and ammunition were imported through Larne, County Antrim. Now, in response to that, you have the Irish Volunteers. Nationalists were afraid that this unionist threat would force the British government to back down and stop Home Rule. As a result, in 1913 they formed the Irish Volunteers, which were led by Owen MacNeill, to make sure that Home Rule would be granted. However, unknown to MacNeill himself, many of the leaders of the Volunteers were also in the IRB. And the IRB, by doing this, hoped to use the Volunteers to fight for this total Irish independence, this total Irish Republic. And the Volunteers imported guns through Howth in County Dublin in 1914. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with the threat of civil war. Ireland now had two armed forces, and this threat of civil war looming larger and larger. Asquith had persuaded Redmond and Carson to talk. He also persuaded Redmond to agree to partition. Partition was dividing the country into two parts. However, Carson and Redmond could not agree on how many counties would be ruled by the Unionists in Ulster. Carson wanted 6 of the counties, whereas Redmond would only agree to 4 counties. And those 4 counties were the counties with a Unionist majority, and they were Derry, Antrim, Armagh, and Down. So how does this stop? Well, negotiations fell apart due to World War I starting when Germany invaded Ireland in August 1914. Britain was forced to declare war, and World War I had officially begun. It was decided to postpone Home Rule until after the war, but Redmond and Carson urged their volunteers to join the British Army, and as we know from later on, Irish history would change forever. That's all for today's lesson. Thanks for listening. I'll be back with another lesson again real soon. Goodbye.